This is Chapter 2 of Bay of the North by Ronald Syme. Pierre Radisson tries to escape. Pierre lay down to sleep, wondering whether he would still be alive the next day. He felt almost as frightened as he had been when the Iroquois first attacked him. He slept badly and was staring wide-eyed over his blanket when the darkness paled into morning. The Iroquois left their canoes on the shore. They walked into the forest and began following a twisting trail to their village. The trees thinned out after an hour's walking. Ahead of them, Pierre saw bright green fields of corn. Beyond them was an untidy line of grayish-brown tents and huts, surrounded by a stockade of pointed wooden posts. As the party emerged from the dim forest into bright sunshine, they were sighted by the villagers. A crowd began running towards them, shouting with joy and screeching cries of welcome. Pierre was quickly surrounded by a jabbering, smelly crowd of Indians. His war party kept him in their midst until they were 100 yards from the big wooden gate leading into the village. There they halted. "Take off your clothes," ordered Pierre's Indian brother. Shocked and surprised, Pierre began to do as he was told. He guessed what was going to happen. The excited Indians had placed themselves in two lines facing inward. Their cruel faces were eagerly turned towards him. In their hands they were holding sticks, iron bars, heavy leather whips, knives, and wooden clubs. They were already waving these weapons with fierce glee. Pierre knew he was expected to run between those two lines. Every one of the Indians in the lines would strike him with whatever he held in his hand. There would be little chance of his ever reaching the wooden gate in the stockade. This was the end, thought Pierre, as he unfastened his shirt with shaking fingers. He had been a fool to think that the Iroquois had meant anything by the kindness they had shown him during the trip. They had no intention of sparing him torture. Even his brother was helping him to strip. There was a tiny chance that if he ran fast enough he might pass through the lines and reach the village. But was it worthwhile trying to escape one kind of torture merely to suffer many others? Pierre was still wondering about that when he was hauled naked to the starting point. At that moment, an old woman suddenly stepped out of the crowd and threw a blanket round his bare shoulders. She caught him by the hand, then turned and said a few words to the Iroquois braves. When she had finished speaking, she drew Pierre after her to a small hut. "Sit down," she said, and silently began preparing a meal over a small fire. Pierre sat staring round him, wondering what was going to happen next. At every second he expected to be dragged out of the hut by the braves who came to peer in at him from the entrance. This treatment was certainly something he had never expected. He wondered when it would end. Pierre did not know that the Iroquois women, especially the older women, were treated as very important people by the warriors. They had the right to save from torture any prisoner to whom they took a fancy. This kindly old squaw had heard about Pierre's bravery when he was attacked in the forest. Someone had also told her about Pierre's skill with a gun and the way he had won the fight with the Iroquois boy. When she threw a blanket across his shoulders, she showed that she was willing to adopt him into her family. From now on, Pierre would be treated by the tribe as her son. Pierre began to realize how lucky he had been as the day went on. One of the old woman's daughters combed his hair, gave him water to wash his face, and handed him the daintiest bits of meat from a fine hot plate of stew. At first, Pierre was too frightened to eat. Slowly his courage came back, and he tried to thank the old woman in the few native words he knew. The following day he made another discovery. The squaw was the wife of the tribe's chief. In other words, his adopted father was the most powerful man in the village. Pierre really enjoyed himself during the next 2 months. There were 3 daughters in the family, and they soon grew fond of their white brother. When the old chief gave Pierre a gun, the young Indian girls went with him into the fields and watched him shoot small animals or birds for food. They took him to other tents in the village, taught him to speak their language, made new clothes for him of fine deerskin, and cooked him delicious meals. By the time summer arrived, Pierre could talk the Iroquois tongue nearly as well as the Indians themselves. He was friendly with almost everyone in the village and took part as a guest in all the feasts and games. He had a gift for making people like him. "Tell me, of what race are you?" his foster mother asked him one day. She spoke in Huron, the language of a northern tribe who lived near 3 rivers and were friendly with the French. "I am a Pinagaga, Iroquois." Pierre replied quickly. He spoke Huron well enough to understand the question, but he carefully replied in Iroquois. The old woman was delighted. "From now on, your name will be Orimha," she said. "Once I had a son of that name. He was killed in battle. I was a Huron, but the Iroquois raided my village when I was a child and brought me back here with them. Now I am an Iroquois, and you are Orimha, my son." There the story of Pierre Radisson might have ended, and if it had, Canada would have lost one of her most famous explorers. Other white captives had been lucky enough to be adopted by Indian tribes. Most of them settled down to their new lives, grateful not to have been killed. Only a few of them ever thought of escaping, and still fewer tried it. But Pierre hated the idea of remaining too long in any one place. He was like that all his life. One day, 3 young Indian braves asked him to go hunting with them. Pierre's mother gave him permission. The 4 young men set out for the woods, Pierre's sisters carrying his heavy pack and his musket until they reached the forest. There the girls said goodbye to him and the other hunters and turned back to the village. The first day's hunting was bad. When evening came, they had killed nothing. Early next morning they started off again, walking slowly along the bank of the Mohawk River. They stopped later in the day, and Pierre watched his 3 companions cut the bark off a birch tree, curve it into shape, lace the open ends with deer hide, and in 3 hours make a canoe big enough for all 4 of them. They paddled downstream, trying to reach a spot where there was more game. Before long they came to a place where another little river flowed into the Mohawk. A small lake had formed here, and its surface was covered with ducks. On the shores grew thick bushes and trees. In this cover lurked plenty of fine fat deer, some of which the 4 hunters killed with their guns. That night and the next, Pierre and his companions grilled juicy fat steaks of venison over the glowing logs on their fire. They were on their way back to the village when they met another Indian. He too had been hunting and asked if he might join the party. Pierre was wearing moccasins and a strip of cloth round his middle. His white skin had been darkened by the summer sun until it was as dark as an Indian's. His sisters had gone on dressing his topknot and shaving the rest of his head. He spoke Iroquois, but he was still not an Indian. The stranger stared at him for a while. When they were alone, he spoke. "You are an Azaroni, or a Frenchman," he said to Pierre in the Indian tongue. "My heart would be glad to see 3 rivers again." "And also mine," said Pierre, without thinking. He stopped quickly when he realized what he had said. "Do not be afraid," said the other man. "I am a Huron. Some years ago the Iroquois took me prisoner but spared my life and took me into their tribe. Is your heart yet with your own people?" "Is your heart yet with your own tribe?" asked Pierre. It was a clever answer. The Indian smiled. Quickly he stepped closer to Pierre. "Let us escape together," he whispered. "I know the way from here to 3 rivers. Tonight, while the others are asleep, we will kill them." Pierre hated the idea of killing them, asleep or awake. The young Iroquois braves trusted him. He had been adopted into their tribe. "No," he said, "I could not do such a thing." The Huron sneered. "The Iroquois have killed and tortured many French people," he said. "Do you love a tribe who have burned the homes of your race and murdered even little children? Shall I escape alone and tell your friends in 3 rivers that you did not want to come back to them?" Pierre began to feel tempted. The Huron went on talking fiercely. "Do you not want to see your father and mother again?" he asked. "Do you not think that they want to see you?" The Indian was right. Pierre was suddenly filled with longing to be with his family again. He knew there was no way of escaping while the Iroquois braves remained alive. They would come after him when they found him gone. Yes, they would have to be killed. Tears came into Pierre's eyes as he nodded his head. "Very well," he said sadly. "I will do as you say." They remained awake that night after their companions had rolled into their blankets and gone to sleep. The Huron sat up quietly and reached out for a tomahawk on the ground. He handed it to Pierre. "Strike when you see me strike," he whispered. "See, here is an axe that will serve me well." Pierre, hating what he had to do, crept over to the nearest sleeper. The Indian chose another victim. They struck at the same time. 2 of the Iroquois died instantly. The Huron tomahawked the 3rd, and Pierre, to make sure the man was dead, picked up his musket and shot him through the heart. They stood listening until the tremendous echoes of the shot had died away in the silent forest. The Huron suddenly stooped and scalped the 3 Iroquois. Next he dragged the bodies to the river and hurled them into the water. Now the way to escape was prepared. They loaded the canoe in a few minutes, pushed out into the darkness of the river, and began paddling as fast as they could. Hour after hour they fled down the Mohawk, at last reaching the Hudson River, where they turned north. They stopped only when the sky began to grow light. Sweating and tired out, they landed on rocks where they would leave no footprints. They rushed the canoe into the forest, hid themselves beside it, and prepared to wait until darkness returned. The river was too dangerous for them by daylight. A steady drizzle soaked them to the skin. Mosquitoes whined through the damp, warm air and bit incessantly. Smoke would drive them away, but the smoke of a fire might be seen by watchful enemies. As soon as it became dark, Pierre and the Huron carried the canoe back to the river. Once again they paddled all night. Day after day went by. Sometimes they hid in swamps, sometimes in dark, lonely forests. At other times they paddled the canoe into high clumps of reeds and slept in the little craft until sunset. No one saw them during the whole voyage. 17 days later, they reached the St. Lawrence, and the Huron told Pierre that they were getting near Three Rivers. By tomorrow evening, he would be safely behind the French stockade. It was dawn when Pierre heard this exciting news. The canoe was safely hidden. Pierre and the Huron had eaten their breakfast of dried meat and corn. They were lying rolled in their blankets, and Pierre went off to sleep, thinking about the joy of seeing his family again. Later, the Huron awakened him. "Come, let us go," he said. Pierre stared around him. It was only the middle of the afternoon. "We must wait until it is dark," he said. "To go along the river now is dangerous. There may be Iroquois war parties somewhere close by." The Huron insisted on leaving at once. "If you do not come with me," he said, "I will go alone. I can wait no longer to see my own people." Pierre had to go. He did not know this part of the river, and it would be impossible for him to find his way to Three Rivers without a guide. Even so, he insisted that a daylight journey was not safe. They were still arguing about it when they launched the canoe. On that fine sunny afternoon they began the last few hours of their flight. The St. Lawrence became very wide before they had gone more than a mile. Its surface was empty. Quickly they began paddling across it, trying to reach Three Rivers before darkness came. The canoe was halfway across when Pierre thought he saw something far ahead of them. The heat was shimmering on the water, and it was impossible to make out the object clearly, but Pierre thought it was something moving along. He pointed it out hurriedly to his Indian companions. "A flight of geese," said the Huron after staring for a few seconds. "There is nothing to fear from them." They paddled on in silence. Pierre felt frightened, but he could not have said why. He knew that danger was close. For the next few minutes he continued staring over the canoe's bow at the strange cloud on the horizon. Suddenly he saw why the Huron had thought it was a flock of low-flying geese. Pierre could see something moving up and down now, like the beat of wings. But they were not wings. They were Indian paddles. "Iroquois!" screamed Pierre. "A war party in canoes!" The Huron realized his dreadful mistake after one quick look. They turned the canoe as quickly as they could. The shore was a couple of miles away, but it was possible that they might reach it without being sighted. Once they were in the forest, it would be nearly impossible to catch them. They paddled as fast as their weary arms could move. Pierre had seen the danger too late. Big canoes, each thrust forward by 5 or 6 Indians, came flying out ahead of the advancing fleet. They were coming straight for Pierre and his companion. The shore was still a mile distant when the Huron knew that they could never get there in time. He reached into the bottom of the canoe and flung the 3 Iroquois scalps overboard. They floated on the water, their topknots showing which tribe the men had belonged to. Indians in the leading canoe bent over the side and snatched them out of the water. They howled with rage as they saw that the scalps were Iroquois. The pursuers drove their canoes on with every scrap of strength in their shoulders. No one who had taken Iroquois scalps was going to escape revenge. Pierre's canoe was 300 yards from the shore when the Indians began shooting. Bullets whined off the water or whistled overhead. A few struck the canoe. Water began spurting into it from little round holes in its sides. Then came more shots. The Huron, sitting in the bow, suddenly flung out his arms and fell backward. He had been hit by 3 bullets and was badly wounded. There was nothing more Pierre could do. He was unable to protect himself, for their 3 muskets were already under water and their powder useless. The bigger canoes swept alongside. Iroquois arms reached out and seized Pierre in a rough grip. He was hauled out of his sinking craft and thrown into the bottom of the Iroquois canoe. Other Indians dragged the dying Huron aboard. The entire fleet pressed on to the shore. 40 canoes were drawn up out of the water. This was a big party of Iroquois. Pierre guessed there must be 150 of them. They were in full war paint and had been raiding the countryside round Three Rivers. With them were other prisoners, 6 unfortunate Frenchmen and 20 Hurons, men, women, and children. From the bow of every canoe dangled a line of scalps. Pierre was rushed up the beach. His Huron companion was still alive, but no longer worth torturing. An Iroquois chopped off his head with an axe and stuck it on a pointed stick planted in the ground. Other Iroquois braves ripped off Pierre's clothes and slammed him against a wooden post. They roped him savagely round his neck, waist, knees, and ankles. On either side of him, other prisoners were being treated in the same way. The Indians then sat down to eat. Pierre was left tied to the post for the whole night. His naked body smarted and stung under the bites of swarms of mosquitoes. But Pierre was past caring about such a minor torment as insect bites. Before leaving him, the Iroquois had brought out a pair of pincers. With vicious joy, they had torn off one of his fingernails. The pain was frightful, yet Pierre knew it was nothing compared with what he would have to suffer before long. This time there would be no one to save him from what he had always dreaded, the torture stake.